Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on driving water efficiency amongst non-household customers. I'm Daniel Johns. I'm Managing Director of Water Resources East, and we've put on this webinar this morning in partnership with Anglian Water and Blue Marble. It's great to have so many people joining us, and I hope we'll have a really interesting discussion later about how we can tackle non-household consumption to reduce it as part of our demand management strategy, which of course is so necessary as part of the Water Resources East's regional plan. In terms of an agenda, we'll do some welcome introductions. Obviously, there are quite a few people on the call, so it will take too long to go around. But if you want to put in chat just your job role and who you work for, maybe something about where you are today as well, just put that in the chat so everyone can see who everybody is. And of course, when you come in at any point, if you want to raise a point or kind of end the discussion, you can put your hand up and maybe introduce yourself at that point as well. The purpose of this morning, as I've said, is really to highlight, first of all, the challenges of water scarcity within the east of England. And then I'm going to hand over to Em Partridge, who's the director at Blue Marble, to give us an overview of the research that they've been doing, commissioned by Water Resources East on behalf of the water companies within the east of England. And then the second half of the discussion, second half of the session this morning, will be a discussion of exactly how can we turn what on the face of it is naturally growing non-household consumption driven by economic development to a reducing position of consumption in order to meet the goals of the Environment Act target on what the national water target within the Environment Act. So that's the goal. We are at this point in time, of course, in consultations, not just for Water Resources East's regional plan, but Anglian Water and Essex and Suffolk Water, Affinity Water have all got their water resource management plans out for consultation, and non-household options are kind of obviously needs to be part of all of their plans. Cambridge Water's plans will be issued by way of introduction to kind of just recap what the Water Resources East draft regional plan said when published back in November, that urgent action is needed by all sectors to manage the region's scarce water resources. This isn't just about households, it's not just about kind of farmers and business, other direct obstructors like for energy and industry, but non-household consumption is a significant proportion of the overall public water supply, and therefore non-household customers need to also play their part in tackling the issues of water scarcity. The east of England is already seriously water stressed, and the chart on the left-hand side would show you where in the region those water scarcity challenges would mount most quickly and most severely by 2050 unless urgent action is taken. Overall, we're expecting a shortfall of 640 million litres per day by 2050, and unless action is taken, that's going to severely constrain agricultural production as well as economic and housing development, and severely depletes the ability of the natural world, of the natural environment to cope with climate change and adapt to increasing pressures, changing rainfall patterns, and we're likely to see rivers, the river health decline even more seriously. When we look within the regional scale modelling, this is the overall kind of jaws of death chart that we produce within the regional plan, which shows that demand, uncurtailed demand, would naturally gradually increase over the course of the 25-year period. That's the top kind of darker blue line. But with demand management action that's already within the plans through from 2025, we're expecting overall consumption and demand for water to actually fall, certainly over the next 20 years or so, but overall, pretty much a kind of flat line position. But as you'll see in a few minutes, the non-household options within the plan aren't as strong as they need to be, and we know that's the case. Certainly for a couple of companies, they've yet to include those options within their plans, and it's only then that the supply side options start to bridge the gap because of the need to return water to the environment, which you can see in the green lines. So the green lines show that as you encompass license caps being imposed within time-limited licenses and permanent licenses, avoiding deterioration to existing water body health, and then trying to return water to support good ecological status, you get a very large supply-demand deficit opening up by 2050. And as I say, even though the options within the plan allow water consumption overall not to increase by 2050, there's more that needs to be done in order to tackle non-household consumption. And that's really shown by this next chart. On the left-hand side, we show for the WRE numbers exactly how the public water supply deficit will be met. Around a quarter of that will be through demand management and about 3/4 through supply side options. On the right-hand side, you can see how those different options stack over time, starting with the leakage control and demand management before we get into things like water reuse, new non-household consumption isn't really factoring into our plans as strongly as it needs to be. The Environment Act targets were set finally before Christmas by the government, reinforcing the position they set out in consultation earlier in the year. And within the overall reduction target is implied a 9% reduction in non-household consumption by 2037, the timescale for that Environment Act targets. So clearly, not only do we need to tackle non-household consumption in order to help square the supply-demand balance, but overall, there's now an expectation from government that across the country, at least at the national level, there will be a 9% reduction in non-household demand. Really importantly and really positively, I think that Ofwat has included a new performance commitment within the PR24 final guidance that was issued before Christmas, and I think we should talk about exactly how that might work and how companies could approach that new performance commitment outcome delivery incentive on non-household consumption. But whilst also recognising within our plan there is still some quite some considerable uncertainty about the future water demand needed to move to a net zero kind of business community to be able to support hydrogen production and also for nuclear power. So whilst at the moment we're expecting kind of modest increases in non-household consumption, it's also one of the areas in the plan where there's still quite some considerable uncertainty. So overall, the challenge is, as I say, non-household consumption will gradually increase in lieu of further action by water companies and others to tackle that rise in demand. But the Environment Act target needs us to reduce that demand, to change the direction, the trajectory from a slight upwards trajectory to one that's down by 9% by 2037. And today's session is all about how we can achieve that. And as I said, WRE, with the support of the water companies within the East of England, commissioned Blue Marble to look into exactly how that can be done. I'm delighted to introduce Emma. Perhaps if you can take control of the slides and take us through the research and the findings that you've come up with.
Lovely, thanks very much. Can I just check that's okay? They're on the screen. Side. Yeah, great. Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much. Well, let me take you through this research, which it actually kicked off about a year ago, but as I will show you, this was a multi-phase study. As I say, it started about a year ago, a very collaborative study, actually, because we knew from the start that in order to do some primary research with non-household customers, we were going to need to engage the retailers. But more importantly, this whole project was about engaging the retailers in the problem, really, that there are barriers to promoting water efficiency and being receptive to water efficiency messages from the non-household customers. So we started with a phase of conducting 10 depth interviews with 10 different retailers, and together we did some literature review of various publications, again, to explore really what the barriers were. Then we went into a series of roundtable meetings with retailers, and wholesalers. Now we asked an individual retailer, one individual, to come to the roundtable meeting with some of the WRE team. This was for commercial confidence, really. We didn't think it was fair to put all the retailers in the room together and talk about possible propositions. So that was a phase which was very informative. It helped us really to develop solutions that went into phase 3, where we conducted 26 depth interviews with non-household customers, and that part took place in the summer. So if we move to the next slide, our objectives in brief really were to really understand the role of water efficiency in those businesses and in the mindset of the people we were talking to understand more about the barriers to water efficiency, and then to explore these straw man propositions that have been developed through the previous phases. Recruitment of non-household customers is increasingly difficult, because obviously retailers hold the relationship. And in fact, it's great to see Claire Galland on the call, actually, because it was Everflow who were very sporting in this project and worked very closely with Anglian Water to basically invite their customers to participate. So we have to acknowledge that the sample for this project were all Anglian Water region customers being serviced by Everflow, but the way it worked was we were given a large database of customers. We then went and put the sample together. And the next slide shows us exactly, we don't normally detail samples quite like this, but actually we had our 26 businesses, and we had set out to achieve as broad a range as possible. And during the literature review, we'd looked at Mosel's sort of theoretical, I suppose, segmentation of businesses, which quartiles against consumption and complexity, those businesses that are using water in a domestic way and those that are using water in a sort of non-domestic way. And this is a really useful segmentation from an analysis point of view, really. And here we can see that we did get a spread. We didn't get any really large users in the sample. They just weren't there. But we did get a spread of businesses in terms of volume, usage, and type of usage. You can get the flavour of it in that low volume, low complexity. It's small preschools and B&Bs and small firms, that sort of thing. Moving up the quartile into the higher volume, low complexity. It's very similar businesses, but they're just bigger. A bigger school, a bigger care home, a bigger guest house, whatever it might be. On the other side, the low volume, high complexity sample, we had quite a few farms, mixed farms, small manufacturers, that type of business. And then at the top, we had, again, larger farms, caravan park. Our largest business in terms of volume was a plant nursery. So that gives you a flavour of the types of businesses we were talking to, usually talking to the owner of the business. And we use this segmentation really as an analysis framework. So I'll move on to talk through some of the key insights. This first slide is some general feedback, which was broadly positive in that our sample reported that they were satisfied with both their water supplier and the retailer. The key touch points inevitably are going to be metering and billing, but it's interesting because the kind of themes we heard about, which will probably be quite familiar to you, customers, they want accurate bills, no surprises, preferably not estimated bills. We had quite a number of businesses who had experienced leaks on their premises at some point or another, and in fact, in terms of leakage, they just want to understand what the cost of that has been. Preferably they want to share that cost. They want to understand it as it happens. Metering, easy access to usage data. We didn't have anyone in the sample who was using a smart meter for water. We were so they would definitely talked about the kind of data they would like. And in terms of communications, it's they want good, clear, professional communications. But at all of these themes, you know, you can see everything pointing towards smart meters in terms of, you know, helping to meet non-household customer needs. You know, throughout all the conversations we were having. So I think on to the next slide, and we're again using our segmentation here just to talk about what we did encounter in terms of water saving strategies and what the kind of mindset was across the sample. And of course, it was a little bit different, you know, by each of these quartiles or segments. I think in all of the segments, though, we did encounter quite a bit of activity in terms of water saving effort, really, even in that low volume, low complexity, whether it was you know, automatic switch off taps or checking for leaking toilets now that they've understood that that's something that can happen, or just putting hippos in the toilet cistern. And again, in the higher volume, low complexity businesses, the green box, again, we saw examples of you know, relatively low cost retrofits or buying water efficient white goods and that sort of thing, and the kind of activities got a bit more complex on the other side of the segmentation, really, with the higher volume, higher complexity businesses, some capturing rainwater or recycling drainage water and those sorts of things. But I think what we saw was that for a lot of businesses, they're not actively looking to reduce their water usage because they don't see how they can do any more than they do already. They may have looked into it a little bit, but if anything is going to cost them money, they're not prepared to really make an investment to do something in order to save money on the volume that they're using in terms of their water and the cost of it. And again, in the more complex business, the sort of purpley blue box, you know, the quote at the bottom there would be quite typical, where they're just saying, well, it's hard to see how we can, you know, we're using it for pigs drinking water. It's not an area we can save water in. So we could begin to see all of the barriers emerging, and we'll come back to those in a more sort of analytical way in a moment. But onto the next slide, more context, really. We also wanted to understand whether these businesses were aware of water supply problems in the region. We just asked the question, you know, as an open question, you know, are you aware that there are, you know, potential for water supply problems? And you know, looking at the data, around about half of the people we interviewed were immediately able to say yes, they thought they did know that this was an issue in the region. And of course, you know, the east of England is a dry area. So, I mean, you know, I don't know whether half is promising or actually quite shocking. It was only half. It's hard to say, really. But we then prompted with more of a statement about the situation in the east of England. And it was interesting because there's not a lot of surprise. It is as if people in the back of their minds know that, you know, there is an issue, and that might have, you know, that might conversations about, well, of course they have reduced their water use through the means that we've just been talking about, but really the overriding sense from the conversation is that there wasn't much of a sense of urgency to tackle the problem, because they think they've done what they can. They can't envisage how they could reduce their water use further. And the big one really is that, you know, energy reduction is so top of mind, more so than ever, really. So our overarching conclusion really was that there's quite a lot of complacency, really. You know, they know it's kind of a good thing to do, but there's a lot of energy and thought going into this. They need a clearer demonstration of how they can save more water, and indeed why it's important to, which we will talk about again in a moment. The next slide it just goes back to some of the conversations we had with the retailers in our initial stage of the project. We categorized really the different conversations into 4 main themes in terms of barriers for the retailers themselves. In the yellow box, they themselves were lacking drivers to kind of offer and put energy into offering water efficiency services for various reasons. Their perception was that this was really the role of the wholesalers. They should be responsible for this. It's their agenda. In terms of their experience with non-household customers themselves, and bearing in mind that we were having these conversations almost a year ago, they just felt that businesses were just not receptive to talking about things like water efficiency when they're just trying to get themselves back on their feet following the pandemic. And a major theme that came out in all the conversations was just the fact that there isn't a starting point when the data isn't accurate or available to customers in the way they needed it to be. So the retailers presented quite a strong case as to why non-household customers were not engaged. Once we were able to go back and reflect on all of those conversations and the 26 interviews that we'd done with the non-household customers themselves, there actually appeared, we felt, to be more engagement amongst the non-household market than retailers might suppose, or several of the retailers anyway that we spoke to in that first stage, not least because we saw the evidence of it. Lots of businesses are implementing some kind of water efficiency measures on their premises, but actually during the conversations about water scarcity, there was a lot of interest coming through in terms of wanting to hear more about how they could save water. And as we'll see when we come on to talk about the propositions, there was considerably more interest there than one would suppose with all of these barriers in play. So on to the barriers in the next slide. We at the end of the project, having talked to the retailers and the non-household customers themselves, we were able to look at all the barriers together. And in fact, we used throughout the project the COMBI framework. This is quite a simple framework for behaviour change that was developed, I think, in the sort of nudge unit type area of the Cabinet Office. And it's useful because you look against capability barriers such as skills and knowledge, opportunity barriers, and motivation barriers. Why would people want to change? What's going to pull them into a new behaviour? And actually, by looking at it this way, it's helpful then to think about what strategies you can use to overcome some of these barriers. There are a couple of capability barriers that are quite clear. One is the lack of accurate consumption data available to non-household customers at the moment. So that's a knowledge barrier, really, but also we observed how people didn't have a sense of how they could be more water efficient than they were already. In terms of opportunity, it's the cost benefit or the lack of that is talked about most often. But also there might be opportunities in terms of when businesses could think about water efficiency that they don't possibly think about at the moment. Then the motivation barriers, we've talked about them, lack of awareness of the water scarcity issue, water restrictions themselves, talking about kind of hose pipe bans or tubs are not seen as a business threat to many organisations. They defer responsibility to the industry or the government to do something about this rather than taking it on themselves. There aren't incentives to save, and there aren't many consequences. There's not much jeopardy of doing nothing in their minds, and certainly their own customers aren't demanding it, which obviously is a very big driver for commercial businesses, certainly. So then just onto the last part of this, we'll just go through the propositions, and we've summarised these very briefly, but I can talk you through the 4 propositions. The first one was about reducing leakage from business premises, and this was via leak alerts. There was a self-audit tool within this proposition, and here we also had some incentives, some find and fix incentives. There was a £500 incentive for an external leak, and a £100 incentive to find and fix internal leaks. So this, I think with all of these propositions, we were looking at what would be motivating, whether it's about a service coming from the retailer or the wholesaler, and just generally getting a sense of how they responded to the different aspects here. And certainly with this proposition around leakage, I think there was a lot of positivity about it. There were, as I say, people in the sample who had experienced leaks and could really understand the dual benefit of both the industry or the, saving water through managing leaks better, and of course for businesses to not have a runaway leak and the cost impacts of that. But also there was some quite kind of proactive elements here in terms of the industry or the retailers proactively sending a leak alert. The incentives again were a pull, a motive to do something about it. So there were positive aspects there. The second proposition was a more general proposition around enabling businesses to reduce water via audit options. And quite simply, this had a self-audit approach or an in-person audit where the water company would send someone to come and have a look at your business. And this was interesting because the self-audit tool really didn't cut the mustard with very many people at all. I think that was harking back to the idea that they felt they'd done what they could, and there wasn't much that anyone could, or wasn't anything else they could think of that they could do. But the idea of an expert coming in, taking a look at their business, was much more compelling because they thought they could learn something new in that case. Possibly less attractive to the much smaller businesses, but to many in the high volume categories, that was really interesting. The third proposition was about encouraging businesses to adopt water recycling. Now, this was really targeted at the larger businesses, and we only did show it to larger volume users. And what this proposition was offering was generic information and tools that would be from the retailer, but there would be in-person audits from the wholesaler. And as part of this, there was a green accreditation scheme. And as I say, we showed this to the higher volume users, and there was, there was a lot of interest in it because the idea of water recycling hasn't reached that many businesses. So I think they felt there was something to learn here, and in fact, the audit in this situation via generic information was really quite popular. I think they felt they could learn something from looking at case studies of other businesses and what they'd done. And then the fourth proposition was a set of things that businesses could do to help them take water efficiency actions, and it involved a set of incentives and rebates. They were not specific, this was all very straw man, but incentive and rebates for proving water had been saved for a period of time, an industry accreditation, and some web-based tools. Again, it was the incentives and rebates that were attractive, and potentially the web-based tools to help achieve those incentives and rebates. But the industry accreditation, probably less so. At the moment, businesses don't see that their customers are asking to see their water efficiency status, and wouldn't think that that was a good investment in terms of effort to go for an accreditation scheme, which they probably thought it would be. So that gives you a flavour of the type of propositions. There's more detail in the main report, but that gives you a flavour. But in finishing off this presentation, a couple more slides which really take us to what the implications of this might be, and we separated this into sort of short-term perspective and long-term perspective. Looking at the short-term first of all, and where we are now, we can see that non-household customers are not strongly engaging with water resilience at the moment, and that kind of cost drivers seem to be paramount in the absence of other types of driver, such as environmental or reputational. And the market dynamics aren't stimulating water efficiency initiatives from the retailers for various reasons. So in the current context, it feels like that the time and effort and investment really needs to come from the water companies at the moment. And this was very much born out of how our sample approached those propositions. The ones that were working best were really those that were coming from the water companies, potentially via the retailer, but it's the leak alerts, the incentives, and the in-person audit and install that was going to come from the water companies that was most attractive, because non-household customers, they're happy to save water to save money, but they don't want to be putting time and effort into this. So the kind of the feel here is that in the short term, it's about implementing the propositions that are proactively offered and really targeting the businesses that are going to be most receptive, which is obviously the higher volume users, but both in that domestic and non-domestic use quadrants, they seem to be equally interested. And then finally, on the final slide is moving really to the long-term perspective, which we're seeing that businesses will see that water scarcity is becoming a reality. There will become more societal and environmental reasons to reduce water use. It has to move beyond really just the cost benefit that seems to be in the business mindset at the moment. But that needs to be communicated, and it might be being communicated through the context of increasingly frequent droughts and restrictions, but hopefully, through interventions kind of before that, communication, new technology, incentives, and so on. So the propositions of least interest to the non-households today seem to rely on them having motivations beyond just cost, and would require effort and potentially investment to invest in these, the self-service tools, the generic advice, or the accreditation schemes. So in the long term, it feels that, what the industry needs to, grasp the nettle is really about mainstream messaging, communicating the existential need to use less water, not just the chance to save some money on their water costs, to be driving new norms, because it's only really at that point when customers are expecting to put their money with businesses that are water efficient, that retailers will also be responding to the needs of non-household customers, who will be prepared to be more proactive, because of course there'll be reputational needs to do that, and indeed the avoidance of business disruption through water restrictions and all that will go on. So it feels like there's they'll get it eventually, just because of what will befall them in terms of climatic conditions, but it's to get into the mindset of businesses before that, through really strong communication about why else you need to save water. And that's where we leave it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma. Right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for putting into the chat your roles and organisations. I mean, first of all, it's just fantastic to have so many people here from different aspects of this challenge, from retailers, from wholesalers, from Mosel, from Ofwat, Consumer Council for Water, and from Waterwise. As Andrew Tucker reminds us, we've also got several members of the retailer wholesaler group that's been working on water efficiency, the subgroup working on water efficiency. So maybe, Andrew, you might be able to give us an update on that in a few moments. But I thought we got some questions coming through on the chat. Perhaps, Emma, if I could turn you toward those. So Daniel from Anglian Water asks whether, the sampling was back in just before the summer. I think you said right at the beginning. So do you expect there might be a slightly different answer now that we've had drought conditions, usage bans imposed at least on household customers? Do you think the kind of sentiment might have changed since then?
Potentially. I mean, we did do the work in fairly warm conditions actually when we were interviewing people, but not necessarily when some of those bans had been put in place. Yeah, I think it does feel like the mood is changing all the time at the moment, but I don't know how significantly. Businesses can be quite insular in their worlds, what matters to them. So I think that's quite hard to answer, actually.
I mean, I guess the other challenge that's really come through in the last 6 months is the energy cost, cost of living challenge more generally, but energy costs in particular, which you mentioned a couple of times, maybe a stronger kind of incentive for people to take action. Again, do you think that might be detecting that? So Philip Stevens from Anglian Water suggests that might be becoming a factor on the household side.
Oh, yeah. I mean, energy is swamping conversations about water. We're seeing that in, our domestic sort of water customer research as well, and the increasing importance really to link the two things, to encourage people to save water as well.
Yeah, I've noticed that's been a recent part of campaigns. I think Water UK, for the first time, are running a kind of full year Water's Worth Saving campaign, looking at the energy costs of things like showering and baths, as well as the water consumption. So George again from Anglian Water asks about rising and falling block tariffs. Is this, to be honest, I don't know whether this is a feature of the non-household market, and do you detect a role for rising block tariffs?
Is that to me? Sorry,
Yes,
was
please,
that a question to me? Yeah, well, I mean, we didn't cover that at all in this research, so yeah, I'd be nervous. It would be Emma Partridge having a view rather than the research, and I think I'd rather I'd rather be the pure researcher and talk through the research. We didn't talk about that. We've looked at that with consumers in the past, but yeah, wasn't a feature of these conversations, I'm afraid. I mean,
okay.
But that might be a conversation for the group.
Indeed. Robert from Southwest Water asked about incentive payments. So one of the measures you mentioned was around, I think, so on leakage, for example, you mentioned £100 payment for internal leaks, £500 for external. Is that money to actually pay for the work itself, or is that a kind of incentive on top of whatever the cost might be?
It was set out to pay for the work itself, and clearly the work might cost more than that, but it might cost less than that as well. So again, there were no kind of terms and conditions sort of thing to these propositions, but that looked pretty good, particularly actually for businesses who either have a jobbing plumber on the team or would do it themselves, or they might. So it may or may not work for them depending how that incentive payment was actually paid. But for some, it looked quite generous actually.
Thank you. Question from John at Mosel. Was there any engagement with customers on the basis of kind of security and resilience of supply rather than cost saving? I think you mentioned that certainly, non-household customers seem to be somewhat complacent about the security of supply. Again, can you perhaps delve into that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, they were, because they almost took it on as information, but then didn't sort of take it further than that in the conversations that we then had with them. And I think remained, even through the propositions, they were largely looking at those as a cost benefit analysis, rather than really buying into the need for wider resilience. The fear of restrictions doesn't seem to be very strong for many businesses. They'd have workarounds. They'd do something different. They'd cope somehow. So yeah, the resilience. I think the resilience is quite a subtle conversation to have, and I think it's quite abstract for businesses at the moment.
Yeah. Interesting question here from Joe at Waterwise about the ability of some non-household customers to actually influence the building that they occupy. You know, if they're on a leasehold, can they make changes to the building that would affect their water consumption? Did that come out at all in the research?
I don't recall that. No, I don't think it did actually.
Okay.
I don't think it did. No.
And actually, yeah, so Claire as well asks about, you mentioned one of your slides about, I think you were talking to retailers about where responsibility should lie for kind of tackling water efficiency, helping non-household customers reduce consumption. And the view seemed to be that it should be a role for wholesalers. Have I got that right? So that retailers think that this should be for wholesalers. Yes. And did you think that was universal, or was there some disagreement on that?
No, it wasn't absolutely universal in the full debrief deck for that first retailer. We actually slightly segmented the retailer voice as well, because there was a spectrum of views. But I think for quite a number of the retailers, they definitely felt that it was not really possible within their margins, their role, what they were trying to do. They were focused on acquisition and delivering customer service, and they felt they had a customer base who just wanted the basics and not any more than that. So there was, and equally felt that actually it's the industry who've got the regulator telling them what they need to do in terms of resilience and security of supply and all the rest of it. It's kind of your problem, not their problem. So that was that was quite a strong view coming out from a good number of the retailers that we talked to.
And obviously, the non-household retail competition was set up in part justified. The impact assessment was based upon the potential for water efficiency savings as a result of competition. That clearly hasn't been the case. And I think Don asks about the barrier around the very thin retailer margins. Again, is that part of the issue? Do you think about retailers feeling they don't have the margin to be able to invest in some of those services?
Yes, it was very much part of the conversation. I think if those retailers who have this view felt that their customers wanted it, or they were pushing on an open door, or there was, but they just couldn't see those benefits. It was going to just cost them time and effort and money to achieve some kind of impact here, and they didn't see how that was going to work in the current situation. So yeah, it was definitely related to that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, I say we've got a wealth of experience on the call. I want to bring bring other people in as well. So if you want to come in on discussion, just raise your hand. Obviously, continue to use the chat for questions. Andrew Tucker, you mentioned that you were part of the subgroup on water efficiency under the retailer wholesaler group. So Andrew, could I perhaps turn to you just to give us an update on where the group has got to, and again how this research chimes with some of the findings that you and others put forward a year or so ago?
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, there's several of us on the call who are all part of that wider group. So please, everyone who jump in and contribute. But overall, the work that was just presented then from Blue Marble was chimed pretty well with the background, the reasons why the situation is as it is, and the challenges that are faced. I think it replicates and supports most of the findings that we came out with that collective work across the sector, which included MOSL regulators, wholesalers, and retailers. The group itself hasn't met for some time. It was working pretty hard for 12 to 18 months to try and get information together, put forward a series of recommendations or options that could play a role in both the retailer exit codes, the REC, or PR24 for wholesalers. So the primary intended audience was Ofwat, to give them a series of, here's the status, here are the problems, here are the barriers, here are some options and recommendations. I would probably say at the moment, some of those recommendations have been picked up. I mean, Daniel, to your point earlier on, I think it's positive that greater emphasis has been given to the business demand agenda inside the wholesaler price review, so PR24. I know this has been recorded, but I personally, at the moment, having read what I've seen so far, I think that momentum in the right way is probably undermined by the metric chosen for the performance commitment. Sadly, I think it's inappropriate, and I'm devastated, to be honest with you, with the metric chosen for that performance commitment, whilst still really happy that there is more emphasis on this agenda. So that's probably a bigger maybe issue outside of here or later on. But I think the retailer wholesaler group for water efficiency hasn't met for a while, just because we worked so hard to influence the two regulatory price mechanisms. We're not quite sure where that plays, where we go now, because we're sort of looking at digesting PR24 and also dealing with the consequences of an unprecedented and record drought year, which is a bit of a game changer with respect to water resources and consumption across the board.
Thank you, Andrew. I was just messaging Sean from Ofwat to see whether he'd like to kind of respond. I mean, to be honest, it'd be really interesting to see and kind of explore what the potential, I suppose, for that performance commit might be. I don't understand the metric that you mentioned, and what a better metric might be. But as I understand, I think is it down for water companies to propose what they would like to suggest in terms of incentives around the performance commitment, or is that being set in stone to some extent?
Probably a question best placed for Sean, unless I'm misinterpreting the what's written in PR24, and there's still stuff to come. But we wanted a metric that was really measurable, and that would enable us to tick one of the key retailer wholesaler water efficiency steering group recommendations around collaborative working. So we wanted something that is transferable across the board. Our concern is with what we've read so far, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sean, if I'm misinterpreting something, but it seems the metric at the moment seems to replicate more of the wider national agenda around a total business demand percentage reduction. I mean, we've put forward in our WRMP very significant business demand reductions, 40 plus meg, and we think we can go higher across the AMP based on our experience of delivering on-site visits, and also with the continuous flow data that we're getting back from smart meters, which has the potential to be massively. But we wanted a metric that reports on the work that we do. So even with a 40-45 meg drop in demand reduction in businesses based on our efforts, there's still a forecasted growth in total business water use. And we look where we are, it's London and the Thames Valley and the home counties area. It's economic growth central, really, in many cases. So growth outstrips what we can physically do there. So the risk is that if you put forward what's your percentage of total thing, I'm going to be putting forward a positive number. That doesn't feel right. I want to be reporting physically what we have done, to say we have not taken 40 or 50 MLD from the environment. And that metric would enable us to work really seamlessly with retailers, because you're reporting a volume of water.
Sure. I don't know. Yeah, do you want to come in on that?
Yes. So I think we're quite clear in the PR24 that business demand is now part of the target. So see that as a positive.
Yep.
So that's been brought into the fold. And looking at kind of we think it's more important to focus on outputs rather than the things that might be done.
You mean outcomes?
Yes, outcomes rather than the things that might be done or illustrated to contribute to that outcome. So that's the decision we've arrived at. We think that makes sense. It also, as it happens, fits with government ambitions to reduce water demand, including business demand. I believe DEFRA are going to have published their target and will be publishing supplementary targets for business demand by the end of the month. So we think that makes sense and fits together. Obviously, there's further work to think about what this performance commitment might look like and how it's measured and so on.
We've got Joe Osborne on the call from WaterWise. WaterWise published last year their second UK water efficiency strategy, which included action on non-household. Joe, can you just kind of come in and give us an update on the strategy, what it said, and how this fits with fits in the strategy?
Yeah, great, thank you. Yes, so the strategy was launched in September. I will, hopefully most of you, I recognise so many names, I think most of you have been very involved in it, so I'm sure you've all read it, but I will... I've
got mine here, there you go.
Oh, brilliant. I'll pop a link in the chat as well. But I suppose when looking through and hearing the research that Emma's done, it felt that, as Andrew said earlier, it very much supports a lot of the findings that have come through already, and those are in the strategy. In particular, Strategic Objective 10 is very much focused on the non-household market and making that really a way to encourage businesses and non-households to use less water. So some of the things that were coming through in there was about the importance of that timely information and giving people timely access to their use. Some of the pieces about the way the market operates as well. I thought one of the things that was interesting was the piece around the accreditations and things, and I think that's something that we should reflect on a bit, because we do have the WaterWise checkmark that we're promoting, and we maybe need to look at how we're doing that and how we can make better use of that as a nationwide piece for people to use. And the strategy as well, throughout, although Strategic Objective 10 is very much focused on non-household, one of the things that came strongly when we were doing the engagement was about the importance of making sure actually non-household need to be coming through in every of the objectives, and the different stakeholders that need to be involved across the strategy. All the different objectives need to have that wide diversity of organisations that are part of it. So it isn't for one organisation to be able to, one type of organisation to be able to make the fix. It does need to have a wider engagement. So I'll pop a link to that into the chat. But yeah, I felt like actually a lot of the research that you showed there supports a lot of what's been put forward. I think the next steps on it is each of the objectives we have is going to be having a working groups around this. So some are already in place, some we want to evolve and develop, and I think the retail group that Andrew just talked about, there's something there about us helping to refresh and bring some of that that work to continue with the strategy focus. And we will be having our water efficiency forum, which invites should be coming out for that next week. Looking at the list again, lots of your names I know from having gone through the list are on there. But if there's anyone who wants to get in touch with me, drop me a line and I can make sure you're added to the invite list if you're not already. So yeah, I think that's a sort of a bit of an overview from us.
Thank you, Joe. I'm keen to bring in the voice of retailers into the discussion as well. And Scott, if I can pick on you, please. You've asked an interesting question earlier. Well, a statement that said that you've seen greater success with incentives being given to retailers rather than directly to customers. Would you mind kind of coming on and saying a little bit more about that and what you would like to see happen?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can please, yeah.
And sorry, I'll need to shoot off in 5 minutes. I've got another appointment I need to go to. So we've seen some success where it's flipped the other way, basically, where we get the incentive to engage with the customer. And just being honest, in the projects that we've done in that form, they've been far more productive than just wholesalers going direct to customers, basically. So I wouldn't mind opening it up to other retailers if they've got experience as well. But I think it's important to manage the customer in terms of who does what, the roles and responsibilities of retailers and wholesalers. And sometimes I feel that that can get quite complex and can cause more issues with customers. So yeah, I appreciate anyone else's feedback, but we've had great success the other way around.
Any other retailers want to come in on the back of that to talk about the work that they've tried, different options, different approaches?
Good morning, everyone. Clark McNally here from Scottish Water Business Stream. I'd echo those sentiments. I feel that we have a close understanding of customer usage, and oftentimes, potentially where a wholesaler can be at arm's length and just sees the consumption figures, we are account managing these portfolios. We've got a very good understanding of how water's used on site before even making that initial approach. And we feel that sometimes we can target a wee bit more accurately where that expenditure should go to try and get the best return on investment. So I do agree in that respect.
Okay. Well, thank you. We've got about half an hour left. I wanted to bring back up the slide deck because we're going to go into a more kind of, say, interactive session at this stage. If I forward it on to the right slide, bear with me. So as I set out at the beginning, certainly within the east of England, the water companies haven't yet kind of fully developed, let's say, their non-household options. And so as it stands, we're looking at a slightly growing consumption on the non-household side by 2050, when we know under the Environment Act, we need to achieve a 9% reduction in non-household water consumption by 2037. We've had some options from Emma. We've already got your experience. We've got the WaterWise work, the subgroup for the retailer wholesaler group that looked into different options. And so what we want to really explore is what actually does need to change collectively in order to turn the tide from rising non-household consumption into falling non-household consumption. So what are the actual practical things that need to change and to happen in order to make that work? And then to split out what that means and who needs to do various different things. And of course, there is a role for government in this, not just to set targets, but potentially to do other things as well. We've talked about Ofwat's move within the PR24 final methodology toward a performance commitment for non-household demand. Clearly, Mosul have a really important part to play in supporting the market and to make it work effectively. We've talked a lot about wholesalers, and are they responsible? What kinds of options should they be bringing forward? But not least to echo recent comments from Scott and others about making sure that retailers are clearly part of the picture as well. And there may well be others. If we can kind of brainstorm either through conversation or through a whiteboard, which we'll bring up in a second, what exactly needs to collectively change to achieve this, and then who needs to do what? And of course, there then is the thorny question about funding. Who's going to pay for it, and where's the money going to come from? So if I could introduce Rebecca from Water Resources East, and I'll share the whiteboard now. Perhaps Rebecca, if you could explain how the whiteboard has been set up and how people can access it.
Yeah, sure. So Daniel's just bringing up the whiteboard now. So hopefully you should all see a loading symbol. So I can see a couple of people are already in it, which is great. So basically, this is just a really interactive way of brainstorming ideas. So you should just be able to scroll in and out just using your mouse cursor. And then hopefully you can all see I'm writing in these kind of orange post-it notes. So yeah, you can just kind of scroll in, scroll out, and just kind of add your ideas. This part here, what is the role for? We've got each of these kind of categories. So the government, regulators, Mosul, etc. So yeah, you're welcome to just add your ideas. As Daniel said, if this is a bit too kind of techie for you, you're welcome to just say verbally, and one of the team will write into the post-it notes. So that's fine.
And Joe's already said that she doesn't have access to this, so I think it may depend on the version of Teams that you're running, or maybe also some kind of controls you might have imposed through your network. So if you haven't got access, then we do want to keep this interactive as well. So if you prefer just to kind of come on, raise your hand and make some suggestions, then please do that. And Rebecca and others will kind of fill in the chart for you. But please feel free to go in and start making suggestions. And I think, just on that first question, perhaps then, what does actually need to collectively, what needs to change? What do we need to achieve collectively in order to shift the dial on non-household consumption? If anyone would like to come in on that. So one of the things that often comes up is about access to data. So the kind of the reliability, first of all, of consumption data, and then access to data from non-household customers. Would anyone like to kind of give us an update either on, for example, what they might be doing about that, or you think what might need to change? So yeah, Andrew.
So the increasing volume of smart meters, AMI meters that give hourly data is huge. It's still early days for that for us, and the more that becomes the norm through AMP8, AMP9 for all water companies, and that has the potential to be a bit of a game changer, but become your platform for all the demand reduction work, whether it's usage, awareness of consumption, continuous flows, which is both leakage and wastage. That there is hugely vital to kind of get that shift in where we are, step change from where we are at the moment, and we're seeing that at the moment. It still takes physical interventions. So we're working with a bunch of retailers to test and learn what works when it comes to engagement. So a huge volume of water that is delivered to businesses is showing up through smart meter data as continuous flow. It's a monster. It's between 25 and 30% of the water, and that's after we've removed the big users that we know are using water for their business around the clock. They've been taken out of that equation, but we're still in the 25 to 30% range of continuous flow. We wouldn't know that without smart meters. So that there is a big shift. The extra one is outside of us. What we've seen in the climate change adaptation world in certain cities, and also linked to energy. So it's off the back of a government target, which puts water efficiency and demand reduction on a national agenda, not just in a water company world, but puts it on the agenda in the same way that you've got CO2 reduction driving businesses now, because you've got a national target. It becomes embedded in finance. And this is critical for us. And this is not, we haven't got this in the group, but we do have to explore it because it drives it with all the sectors. So if you want a loan, if you want to be insured, if you want a mortgage, business loan, the water efficiency and the reduction in demand becomes a statutory requirement as part of that financing agreement. So lenders, insurers, actuaries now require large businesses and sectors here and internationally to be achieving their targets on CO2 reduction, energy efficiency, in order to be financed. That if we can embed water into that, all of a sudden it becomes core business across businesses and sectors, as opposed to water companies trying to chip away at an iceberg with a teaspoon. And I think until we get to that, sort of making it core business outside of the water sector, like we have businesses out there want to save water because it's the right thing to do, like they're doing now, wanting to reduce carbon and energy. Until we get to that, we're never really going to shift this agenda the way it needs to be done.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's bring in Claire, I think, from Everflow.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I just talking about the sort of idea of customers wanting more data and to be able to prove, what their demand is, what their usage is, what the impact of the interventions is. I think, for smaller customers, that's not altogether necessary, but there is things around to get over the complacency and the urgency issue. With customers, retailers can, and we are starting to do that, is bring together all the data that's available about customers in a clever way that enables you to benchmark in a very personalized way to each customer. You have personalized communications. You can actually show them the cost benefit of what would their bill look like if they changed from being like in the top 10% of usage in their sector to the bottom 10%. And you know, I think I liked the idea about the certification being linked to a rebate of some sort. That's something that retailers could look to do, or wholesalers, or both. But so thinking about benchmarking customers' usage, the timing of the campaign, so that when they are thinking about their new budgets at certain times of year, or whether they have had a continuous flow recently, which we could use logger data from wholesalers, or whether there's just been a drought or there's likely to be a deficit that year. It's, you know, all these things kind of converge into a really compelling message for the customer. And you know, we're seeing that some customers will be willing to pay for certain services, even small ones. So it's as long as you can show the cost benefit, and in line with the water efficiency RWG group research, you know, we're aiming to offer water efficiency interventions that, you know, offer a return on investment within 6 to 12 months, and that seems to be the expectation from customers. So if you work within those sort of parameters, I still think, you know, there's a lot that retailers can do and still make some sort of margin on the water efficiency services.
Just tying your comments with Andrew's together and the rollout of smart meters, are you starting to have kind of smart meter data coming through to use a retailer? You know, is it coming through in the right format? Is it interoperable with data from other water wholesalers? Can you see smart metering in the same way that Andrew does, helping to kind of change the game in some way?
Well, we're obviously a national retailer where our customers are evenly distributed across all the wholesaler areas, and they are quite engaged customers because they've all actively switched to us. Most, yeah, it's in sort of single figures, the number of deemed customers we've got. Yeah, I think, you know, there are various wholesalers offering us free data. It's all in different formats, so it requires a lot of processing at our end, either manually or building something automated that would enable us to do that. And yeah, there's various national projects going on, Market Improvement Fund, etc., that are looking at sort of making that more standardized, which would make it a lot easier for us to do things with. But you know, we're looking at various projects with one wholesaler. We're looking at using AMR, not just AMI data. And seeing how useful that can be in terms of identifying continuous flows and having that initial conversation with the customer where you've actually got some specific information about them that's current, and you're saying to them, you've got something's going on here, and monitoring the impact of whether or not that has an effect, whether they fix it themselves, they might not even tell you. And so we've done a project with Thames where we looked at the impact of that, and it was quite reasonable compared to what Thames's usual engagement rate was. Yeah, we're just looking at piloting different approaches at the minute, but yeah, certainly the smart data that's available isn't that usable for us at the moment. We kind of need the wholesaler to process it in a way that says, can you contact this bid, because they've got a continuous flow.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, again, just back to the whiteboard for a second. I can see in the chat that quite a few people aren't able to access it. Please do either just put comments into the chat or stick your hand up and come in to kind of put your points across. But there are some really good suggestions coming through, so do please keep them coming. Let's turn to John. Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel. And a couple of builds. I think Claire's covered the first one. So just on the consumption benchmarking, I think that's a really important one. So as we start to see growing pockets of smart meter data and can have a more informed view of how their water is being used, what the likely leakage or wastage is. If we're going to start to be able to apply that to the larger data set, the 1.2, 1.4 million business customers, we're going to need a meaningful segmentation, and we don't have that at the moment. So there's a really important project, a market improvement fund project led by Joe and Anglian, looking at development based on their water use. I think if we can combine that with those pots of growing smart meter data, we can get a meaningful schema, which is great. The second challenge then, though, is then applying all of that knowledge to the whole customer data set, across those 1.2, 1.4 million customers, because we know that customer and even the address data is pretty poor. So there's a direct link, I think, to being generally improving that core market data quality, and then being able to use that to drive, as Claire says, informed conversations, more engaging messaging, and driving that customer awareness up. So I think all three of those things sort of come together, because it'll be some time before we have very widespread coverage of smart meters.
Yeah, indeed. Just within the east of England, so Anglian Water clearly are planning to roll out by 2030. But then we've got Cambridge and Essex and Suffolk, Essex and Suffolk Water, following by 2035, and I think Affinity by 2040. So yes, it's not going to be tomorrow or next year, but certainly it is starting to happen, which again is going to be really positive. Michelle, let's bring you in from Anglian Water.
Hi, yes. So from Anglian perspective, in terms of our smart metering programme, we do value the importance of sharing the data, where we introduced our retailer data exchange to provide granular data to retailers. But one of the things that we also want to look at is it kind of understanding sort of the new technology and starting to future-proof it. So looking at other initiatives as well, how we can share the data. So we've kind of initiated a project with using the Market Improvement Fund Project Emits to allow regular monthly data to go direct into CMOS, so that we can have sort of the market one version of the truth going in. It's a system-to-system transfer going through and utilising some of the new functionality. And part of all of these discussions is all around data standardisation, to try and make it easier for everybody in the industry to use the data and actually sharing it, but not and using it to the full benefit, and taking that forward. So I think it is always important to share data, but it's how we actually use it going forward. And if we can standardise that for everybody to use it in a consistent way, I think that's the best way forward.
Yeah, thank you. Philip, again from Anglian, who clearly is the author of the demand management projections that we've used within the Water Resources East plan. So Philip?
Yeah, I think it was just that piece, and I've written in the kind of note there, really. I think there is the piece that did come out throughout this process of clarification from the regulator ultimately as well. I think there is this piece about the fact that we certainly, as public water companies, have statutory duties under WRMPs to manage supply demand balance, and obviously, as echoing Andrew, really, obviously we are also bound by targets that are being set by Ofwat and the EA to actually meet those supply demand issues, basically, and this resilience and sustainability going forward. I think the piece of that is just the clarification with respect to retailers and non-household itself, how they fit in with that in a sense, and ultimately how we share that responsibility across us. Now, from all the conversation we've had, it is in mind for a lot of the retailers that they're very keen on water efficiency, but I think there is this clarification from a regulatory point of view of how that's shared, and then ultimately when we do fund water efficiency options, be it ourselves or retailers, and if it is us, how we fairly do that ultimately, so that we're not kind of favouring one retailer over another or favouring one non-household customer over another in a sense. So I think there's kind of an interesting piece about that going forward as well, really.
Yeah, thank you. Just going back to the whiteboard, I know that some people can't see it. Just in terms of kind of suggestions for the roles of different organisations in helping us tackle this collectively. There's quite a bit for government, a couple for government at least, a few for retailers, one for wholesalers, but none at all for regulators. So kind of picking up Philip's point there about what more regulators could do to help kind of support this, and nothing for Mosul either. Does that mean that there's Mosul has a clean bill of health and nothing there's nothing to do on that front? So I can see people start to click into the regulator spot, which is good. So fill those out. But just, yeah, Sean, again in the chat, you've mentioned the reform of the market performance framework, which is a further tool for incentives. Would you mind saying more about that? That's not one that I've come across.
Yes, just really to reiterate that there are a number of sort of regulatory and industry tools that can provide incentives, so sort of around the question of incentives really. So we've already talked about PR24, and we've got the performance commitment there that includes business demand, but the reform, the current review and reform of the market performance framework provides another opportunity for incentives to be put in place. I don't know what those look like before people ask, but there is a big review going on of what that framework looks like, and it's the water efficiency topics are not outside that framework, so it's an opportunity really. I mean, again, we haven't worked through those details, but potentially you're looking at financial incentives, either financial penalties or financial rewards in terms of activities or outcomes linked to improved water efficiency. So it's another tool effectively, and it's potentially a powerful tool.
Right, thank you. Just, yeah, turning to the suggestions, just looking at, first of all, one for government. There's no one here from government, as far as I can tell, to pick these suggestions up. But first of all, building regulations, clearly very important for household customers, and we're still expecting the building regulations roadmap to come out from government at some point, primarily for the household sector. But building regulations for non-household water efficiency is clearly very important. One for DLUC. And for BEIS, looking at the implications of carbon capture and storage, which is a very water intensive process for cooling. And clearly that will have a big impact on certain companies in certain regions, well, not companies necessarily, but certainly in terms of abstraction around the country, depending on where CCS really starts to take off. Some suggestions and asks for wholesalers providing consistency in approach. So currently all wholesalers approach water efficiency differently, and therefore it's extremely difficult for retailers and end customers to engage with that, particularly where they span multiple sites. Another suggestion here, share supply demand forecasts for sustainability and resilience issues in a meaningful fashion, which again probably picks up the consistency point. Sorry, Philip, do you want to come in?
It was just on that piece, really. I suppose it was in mind, obviously, given the conversation, as I say, and knowing the actual kind of targets that we're now being set, of being mindful of that piece about hydrogen and carbon capture, which aren't just kind of like minor changes to demand in the future. They are massive changes to demand in the future in the non-household sector. And certainly, as I say, I know we're all in the conversations at the moment where we're looking and thinking about how that might be met. But certainly with respect to targets, it is one to bear in mind. It's not just a small change in future demand. It's absolutely massive changes in demand in the areas where those clusters are going to come to, come about, really, be it Southernmoorbank or Tees or the others, basically.
I was assuming, though, that most of that consumption will be through direct abstraction as opposed to public water supply.
It might well be. It might well be the fact that we're not doing it. But in real terms, I'm thinking about your hat with your WRE hat on, basically. In terms of overall abstraction or water demand from somewhere, it will be real water demand from somewhere. And in terms of whether it's desal, or that area, it's still going to have environmental impact and be non-household demand in a sense. So there is a piece about public water company non-household demand. There's a wider piece about all of it in a sense, which obviously I say isn't your domain, Daniel.
No, fair enough. Yeah. Just looking at the retailer cluster here on the whiteboard, there's certainly responsibility clearly for retailers to own that customer relationship, communication, deliver added value services, and to make sure that nothing that wholesalers do on non-household water efficiency kind of undermines that customer relationship that's so important to the effective operation of the market. There's a couple now that have popped up since my plea for Mosul. Again, I think there's people from Mosul on the call. So helping to future-proof as a centralised player, enhancing opportunities, exploring the role of a national metering strategy for non-household, which is a very interesting suggestion there. and incentivize improvement in market data quality given data standards. And there is a challenge, I guess, if all the water companies are rolling out smart metering programs using slightly different technology, slightly different data operability standards. Again, someone's just popped up with data interoperability standards for granular consumption data. That seems to be a really, really important nut to crack. So going back up to what needs to collectively change, again, picking up that point, standardized data, standardized access, quite a lot around awareness, making sure that non-household customers are aware of the need to save water, and more around additional understanding of future demands, requirements for new industrial clusters, hydrogen capture, carbon capture and storage. Picking up Philip's point. So lots collectively that need to be taken. Not so much yet in who's going to pay for what and how this will be funded. So through the performance commitment as part of PR24, there is at least those incentives I assume will be paid for through customer bills, and the more that water companies do to achieve and exceed their targets, that creates a direct financial incentive and the funding for the work to achieve that in the first place. So presumably that means that wholesalers potentially can tap into some funding to deliver water efficiency campaigns, actions, the audits and leakage control strategies that Emma was talking about earlier. There's nothing yet in actions to take forward, but we've got just a couple of minutes left really to try and draw things together. So lots of really interesting suggestions. The whiteboard will capture and we can circulate afterwards together with a recording of today's webinar. If anyone does want to come in with any kind of last minute comments on how we can take things forward. But I think really the challenge for water companies, the wholesalers on this call, is what do they include within their next round of water resource management plans? As I said earlier, the companies are consulting on their draft plans at the moment. The Anglian Water and Essex and Suffolk have yet to play in their non-household options. So now is the time to make some suggestions to say, through responding to their consultations, what you would like to see on the non-household side be factored into their final plans when they're submitted next summer. And also just thinking about how Cambridge Water and Affinity have already got non-household consumption options within their draft water resource management plans, what you think of them and how they can go further. So just kind of again pausing in case anybody wants to come in, but I think the main point is, in terms of next steps, what is it that water companies should be including within their plans? How can they work more effectively with retailers who own the customer relationship? The funding, of course, is a really important consideration. And of course, on the back of the water efficiency national water saving target in the Environment Act, what more can government be doing to drive water efficiency, both within household and non-household customers? So I think probably, again, with 3 minutes to go until the end of the session, perhaps if I wrap it up there, just to say thank you ever so much, first of all, for Emma and the Blue Marble team for conducting the research and delivering such a great presentation here this morning. Thank you all for your engagement. It's been brilliant to have such a mix of different people on the call and contributing in terms of your experience, to have both retailers and wholesalers take part, as well as regulators, MOSL, Consumer Council of Water and Waterwise. And so perhaps if I wrap it up there, thank you very much from Water Resources East. It's a brilliant session, and look forward to catching you up next on our next call. Thank you very much.